Summer 2026. The headline hits every outlet within hours. Polestar banned from selling cars in the United States. And buried under that headline is the detail almost nobody led with. Polestar's own sister brand, Volvo, same ownership, same parent company, applied for an exemption under the exact rule that just ended Polestar's American business. Volvo got it. Polestar never even asked. Gothenburg, Sweden, headquarters of a car company most Americans couldn't place on a map, even after they'd heard its name 100 times on a podcast ad. The regulation behind all of it is called the Connected Vehicle Rule, built to keep Chinese-made software and hardware out of American cars, over concern that a vehicle's cameras, radios, and control units could quietly report home to Beijing. On paper, Polestar fit the profile. Majority owned by Geely, the Chinese conglomerate that also controls Volvo. A company selling electric cars assembled with components, the rule was specifically written to flag. The story wrote itself. Another casualty of tightening trade policy. Another electric vehicle brand caught in a geopolitical squeeze it never asked for. Except the exemption, sitting right in front of Polestar, tells a different story. Volvo applied for it and kept selling cars in America without interruption, without a press release, without a single dealer filing a lawsuit. Polestar did not apply for that same exemption, and when the ban came down anyway, Polestar did not appeal it. That is not the behavior of a company fighting to stay in a market. That is the behavior of a company looking for the nearest door and calling it locked from the outside. This is where the story that ran in every headline starts to fall apart, and where a different one begins to take shape. Not a story about a government shutting a door on a foreign automaker, a story about an automaker that had already decided to walk through that door years earlier and needed someone else to hold it open. Because by August 2026, a lawsuit would surface with a number attached to it, $25 million. Filed not by a regulator, not by a competitor, but by one of Polestar's own dealers in New Jersey, a company called Prestige Imports. And buried inside that filing was an allegation far more damning than anything about software or national security. It claimed Polestar had spent 2 years secretly planning to leave the United States, then maneuvered its own government into banning it, so it could walk away from the very people who had trusted it enough to build their businesses around its future. The lawsuit itself is dated August 13, 2026, filed in New Jersey by Prestige Imports, a dealer group that had sold Polestars out of a showroom in Bergen County since the brand first arrived in the US. The filing asks for $25 million, but the number that matters most in this story is not the one on the cover page. It is the timeline buried inside it. According to the complaint, Polestar spent roughly 2 years quietly working through the mechanics of leaving the American market altogether. 2 years of internal planning, while the public-facing version of the company kept talking about growth, kept talking about new models, kept talking about a future in the United States that the lawsuit alleges Polestar's own executives no longer believed in. Here is where the timeline turns from uncomfortable to almost unbelievable. As late as February 2026, 4 months before the connected vehicle rule ban took effect, a Polestar executive allegedly signed off on a multi-year expansion plan for Prestige's dealership in Bergen County. Not a minor tweak. An actual expansion tied directly to the planned 2028 launch of the Polestar 7, the brand's next flagship SUV. Think about what that timeline actually requires you to believe. A company that had already spent roughly 2 years planning its exit from the United States looked a dealer in the eye in February 2026 and asked that dealer to expand its facility, hire toward a bigger footprint, and build out infrastructure for a car that would not arrive for another 2 years. A car Polestar may have already known it would never sell in America at all. 4 months. That is the gap between an executive allegedly approving an expansion tied to a 2028 product and the government ban Polestar would later use to explain why none of it would happen. No dramatic reveal was needed to make this land. The dates alone did the work. February 2026, an expansion approved. June 2026, the connected vehicle rule ban takes effect. July 2026, a letter goes out to dealers blaming the government for a decision the lawsuit says Polestar had been steering toward since before the expansion was ever approved. Prestige Imports did not build a bigger showroom because it gambled on a hunch. It built because a Polestar executive told it to, in writing, months before the company would later claim its hand had been forced by forces entirely outside its control. That is the part of this story that stings the most. Not that a car company left a market. Companies leave markets. It is that dealers were still being asked to invest in that market's future, while the exit was reportedly already being planned in Gothenburg, quietly, 2 years in the making, 4 months from finished. Behind every alleged scheme sits a simpler explanation, and this one comes with a number attached. Ohio Senator Bernie Moreno, quoted in coverage of the case, put it in terms blunt enough to cut through all the language about national security and connected vehicle software. Polestar, he said, was losing $30,000 to $35,000 on every single vehicle it sold in the United States. Then came the line that reframes the entire saga in 11 words. Polestar was screwed by Polestar. It wasn't screwed by the US government. Let that number settle for a second, because it is not a rounding error or a bad quarter. $30,000 to $35,000 lost per car, multiplied across every Polestar 2 that left a dealership lot in America, is not a company absorbing short-term pain to build market share. It is a company hemorrhaging money on every single transaction, year after year, with no plausible path to reversing course inside the market it claimed to be fighting for. And the losses did not stop once a car left the lot. They followed it. IC-Car's data shows a new Polestar 2 loses 58.1% of its value within 5 years. A car that starts at a manufacturer's suggested retail price of $64,800 is worth roughly $27,170 by the 5-year mark. That is not a rough patch. That is a car losing well over half its value before most owners have finished paying it off. For context, the average luxury electric vehicle depreciates 54.5% over 5 years. Polestar was already running above that, and against the average sedan, which depreciates 38.9%, Polestar was losing value at nearly double the rate. Put those two numbers side by side, and a business model comes into focus. And it is not a flattering one. Polestar was losing tens of thousands of dollars manufacturing and selling each car, while the cars themselves were losing value faster than almost anything else on the road once they reached a customer's driveway. There was no operational lever left to pull. Not pricing, not incentives, not a clever marketing push. The math simply did not close, and every additional year in the American market meant compounding a loss that had no natural ceiling. This is the part of the story that never made the headlines about bans and software restrictions. Long before any regulator wrote a single rule, Polestar's American business was already bleeding out on its own, quietly, one undersold, overdepreciated car at a time. Every company that decides to leave a market has options for how to do it. Negotiate exits with dealers, buy back inventory, offer settlements. Wind down slowly and publicly, the way brands that actually get caught off guard by regulation tend to. Polestar had a far cleaner option sitting right in front of it, one its own corporate sibling had already used successfully months earlier, and it chose not to take it. Volvo, owned by the same parent company, Geely, applied for an exemption under the connected vehicle rule. The exemption existed for exactly this situation. An automaker with ties to Chinese manufacturing that could demonstrate its systems did not pose the security risk the rule was written to prevent. Volvo made its case. Volvo received the exemption. Volvo kept selling cars in America the following week as if nothing had happened, because for Volvo, nothing had. Polestar never filed for that same exemption. When the ban arrived anyway, the company that had spent years building a public narrative about its future in America did not appeal the decision. No legal challenge, no public fight, no dealer town hall insisting the brand would find a way through. Just silence. And then a ban that Polestar would soon describe as something that had happened to it, rather than something it had allowed to happen. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in this story. A company genuinely blindsided by a regulation fights that regulation with every tool available, because its entire business depends on the outcome. A company that has already decided to leave does not need to fight anything. It only needs the appearance of having tried. Then came the letter. In July 2026, Polestar sent dealers what it called a force majeure notice, the kind of language usually reserved for hurricanes, wars, acts of nature beyond anyone's control. The letter placed the blame squarely on the government and the connected vehicle rule, framing Polestar's American exit as something that had been forced upon it from the outside. There was a problem buried inside the letter's timing, and it was not a small one. New Jersey's Franchise Practices Act requires automakers to give dealers 60 days notice before terminating a franchise relationship. Polestar's letter did not offer that window. It landed as something closer to an announcement than a negotiation, informing dealers of a decision rather than beginning the legally required process of unwinding one. Line the sequence up end to end, and the picture stops looking accidental. An exemption available and unused. A ban left unappealed. A letter that blamed a government for an outcome the company itself had steered toward, sent without the notice period state law demanded. Each individual choice might be explainable on its own. Stacked together, they read less like a series of unfortunate events, and more like a company that had already written its exit memo long before it ever mailed the letter announcing one. I keep coming back to that Bergen County showroom, the one Prestige Imports agreed to expand back in February 2026. Somewhere in New Jersey, there is a construction plan, maybe a contractor's invoice, maybe a lease amendment, all built around a car, the Polestar 7, that was not supposed to arrive until 2028. Someone signed off on floor space, someone hired toward a bigger service department, someone made payroll decisions based on a future that a Polestar executive had personally approved in writing. That is not an abstraction. That is a family business, real employees, real square footage, built on the reasonable assumption that when a manufacturer tells you to expand, the manufacturer intends to still be there when the expansion is finished. This is the part of the story that rarely makes it into headlines about federal bans and connected vehicle software, because dealers are not a dramatic constituency. They do not trend. But franchise laws exist for exactly this reason, to prevent precisely the scenario the Prestige Imports lawsuit describes. A manufacturer cannot simply decide it no longer wants a market and walk away without paying dealers fair value for the businesses those dealers built at the manufacturer's own encouragement. That protection is the entire point of laws, like New Jersey's Franchise Practices Act. It exists because the manufacturer always holds the power in that relationship, and the dealer always holds the risk. What the lawsuit alleges is a kind of shortcut around that protection. If a government ban forces a company out of a market, that looks, at least on paper, different from a company choosing to leave on its own. One triggers obligations to compensate the dealers left behind. The other, if the ban was invited rather than imposed, might not, at least not without a court deciding otherwise. That is the $25 million question sitting at the center of Prestige Imports' case, and it is the reason this lawsuit is being watched by dealers for brands far beyond Polestar. There is a version of this story that echoes something else entirely, a different brand, a different vehicle, a different set of buyers who trusted a company's stated plans and ended up holding the bag when reality diverged from the promise. The shape is familiar, even when the details are not. Someone makes a commitment, someone builds their life or their business around that commitment. The company changes course. The people who trusted the commitment are the last to find out and the first to pay for it. Prestige Imports is not asking a court to relitigate national security policy. It is asking a court to decide whether a company can use a government action it allegedly maneuvered into existence as a shield against the very obligations that policy was never designed to erase. Whatever the court decides, the dealership in Bergen County still sits there, expanded, waiting for a car that may never come. Go back to the headline that started all of this, the one that ran in almost every outlet the week the ban took effect. Polestar banned from selling cars in America. A story about a foreign company caught in the machinery of a national security rule it never saw coming. That version of events was clean, simple, and almost entirely wrong. Volvo took the exemption sitting right in front of it, applied, qualified, and kept selling cars in the United States without a single dealer filing a lawsuit or a single showroom sitting half-built for a product that would never arrive. Polestar had the same option, under the same ownership, facing the same rule, and chose not to reach for it. That choice alone should have been the headline. A company was offered a door out of the very crisis it claimed had trapped it, and it left that door closed. Everything that followed only makes sense once you accept that the ban was not an ending Polestar suffered. It was an ending Polestar needed. $30,000 to $35,000 lost on every car sold. A vehicle depreciating faster than almost anything else in its category, faster than luxury electric rivals, nearly double the rate of an ordinary sedan. 2 years of alleged internal planning to leave a market that was quietly bleeding the company dry, followed by a dealership expansion approved 4 months before the exit, followed by a letter blaming a government for a decision that letter's own timing could not explain. Bernie Moreno said it in 11 words, and by now, the whole story bends around that sentence. Polestar was screwed by Polestar. It wasn't screwed by the US government. Not a regulator, not a trade war, not a foreign policy decision made in Washington with no regard for the automaker caught in its path. A business that could not stop losing money in a market it may have already decided to abandon, reaching for the nearest convenient explanation the moment one appeared. The $25 million question now sits in front of a New Jersey court, and it is bigger than one dealership in Bergen County. If a manufacturer can maneuver its way into a government restriction and then use that restriction to sidestep the obligations it owes the people who built their businesses on its word, every dealer for every struggling brand just learned something uncomfortable about how little their trust is actually worth. Somewhere in Gothenburg, the spreadsheets probably still show the same math they showed 2 years ago. Losses that never had a ceiling, a car that lost value faster than it lost relevance, and an exit that needed a villain other than the mirror. The government made an easy one. The lawsuit says the real villain never left the building. Polestar isn't the only electric vehicle brand that dressed up a retreat as a disaster nobody could have predicted. Fisker did something strikingly similar in its final year, and that story is even harder to believe.